Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 553. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today is March 6th, 2024, and I actually got a few good news stories to start off today's show. So that'll be a little bit of a change of pace for everyone, talk about some good news. Just a little bit here, and then we'll get into all the bad news of the wars going on in Gaza and Ukraine. If you want to share the show, best way to help the show out is just to share it, put it out there to more listeners. The show is hosted through the Libertarian Institute, and so go libertarianinstitute.org and check out everything we have on the site. Of course, it was founded by the great Scott Horton and Sheldon Richman. Now we have other greats: Keith Knight, Ted Galen Carpenter, Lori Calhoun, Jim Bovard, myself, Connor Freeman, Will Porter, Patrick McFarlane. Lots of great people at the Libertarian Institute doing a lot of great work. You can find this show, Conflicts of Interest, on the homepage. You can also find the news section at the Institute, where I write a few articles every day. Usually I talk about them a little bit on the show. You can also find all my work by following me on Twitter. I'm at Kyle Anzalone_. You could subscribe to this show. The video version is up on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. The audio version is up anywhere you could listen to podcasts. And of course, you should always just subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. Make sure you hit an alarm bell if the outlet has a feature to do that. That way you get the notifications, talking about these kinds of things, dissenting against the war in Ukraine, the war going on in Gaza. It gets us pushed down in the algorithms. And so we really have to rely on our listeners to put us out there to new people, because, we're getting downranked in the algorithms all the time. All right, now let's get into the news today, and starting off with the first little bit of good news here. Representative Tom Massie to bring Julian Assange's brother to Biden's State of the Union. So Representative Massie, of course, he's a Republican from Kentucky, will bring Gabriel Shipton, the brother of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, to President Biden's State of the Union address this Thursday night. Massie wrote on X, President Biden will be looking at Julian Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, in the House Galley on Thursday night as Biden delivers the State of the Union address. Bringing Shipton as his guest is a part of Massie's strategy to pressure Biden to jump the charges against Assange, who is facing up to 175 years in prison if he is indicted and convicted in the U.S. for exposing U.S. war crimes by publishing documents obtained by a source, which is a standard journalistic practice. Massie told the Carrier Journal the U.S. government's ongoing effort to prosecute Julian Assange threatens the First Amendment rights of the American people and should be opposed. Massie added, during his term in office, I asked President Trump to pardon Mr. Assange, and I was disappointed by his failure to do so. President Biden should stop seeking Assange's extradition and should instead drop the criminal charges currently being pursued by the Justice Department. So, this is all very, very important, especially to what I do, because this is journalism that is under attack here. The First Amendment is under attack. And, not only is the First Amendment under attack, but Julian Assange is not an American citizen. He just published documents that were leaked to him by Chelsea and Manning, who's already done her time in jail for this crime. And so, there's no crime being committed by Julian Assange. This is just trumped up charges. And initially it was a part of, and really the only part of, Trump's war on journalism during his term in office. Now, Biden ran on a return to normalcy and ending Trump's war on journalism, except he's, extended the only real piece of the war on journalism that Trump had going. Remember back to the Obama administration when Biden was vice president. The Justice Department concluded that there was a New York Times problem with persecuting and prosecuting Julian Assange over the documents that WikiLeaks has published. And the New York Times problem is that there's nothing effectively different that Julian Assange does from the New York Times. And so if we go after Assange, that's saying that any administration could go after any outlet, including mainstream ones like the Washington Post and the New York Times. And so this should be a major issue. But Biden just steamed right ahead with it, and it didn't seem that all those left-wingers who were crying in the streets for 4 years while Trump was president, saying our democracy was under threat, all the, Rachel Maddow's of the world don't seem to care at all that Joe Biden is waging this war on journalism and nearly has one of the most important journalists on the entire globe locked up in an American prison. So Assange, an Australian citizen, has been held in London's Belmarsh prison since Trump administration indicted him under the Espionage Act in 2019. Last month, Assange's legal team presented its case for appeal to the UK Home Secretary's decision to extradite Julian Assange to the US, and whether that decision on whether or not he can appeal his extradition is expected to happen soon. The defense team introduced new evidence, including a bombshell report from Yahoo News that revealed that the CIA, under Director Mike Pompeo at the time, considered kidnapping and even discussed assassinating Assange over WikiLeaks publishing documents the CIA found embarrassing, including those known as Vault 7. WikiLeaks and Assange supporters are asking Americans to put pressure on Congress to oppose the extradition. Americans can call their representatives to support H-Res 934, a bill introduced by Representative Paul Gosar, a Republican from Arizona, that calls for the U.S. to drop charges against Assange. All right, next up here, this one from Kevin Gonstola, published at The Dissenter. Drone whistleblower subjected to harsh confinement finally released from prison. So Kevin writes, drone whistleblower Daniel Hale was released from prison in February after spending 33 months in some of the harshest confinement conditions ever exposed on a person for disclosing classified information to the press. Though through President Donald Trump's Justice Department indicted Hale, his case has become a major Espionage Act conviction by prosecutors under the Joe Biden administration. In an opinion article for Al Jazeera English, Hale marked his freedom by weighing in on the decision by the special counsel Robert Hur not to recommend charges against Biden for mishandling classified information. Hale noted the similarities between what he did and what Hur said Biden did, and powerfully illustrated the desperate treatment that he survived. Both Biden and Hale kept classified information outside of a secure facility at their homes and offices. Both spoke to a reporter about the information. Both expressed concerns about the U.S. official policy, with Biden objecting to the 2009 surge in Afghanistan, and Hale objecting to the consequences of the prolonging war. Biden was left off the hook because he didn't mean any harm, Hale wrote. In contrast, the government's pretrial motions in my case argued that I not be allowed to present evidence of what are called my good motives. Afraid my motives might make me appear too sympathetic to a jury, I, like every other whistleblower before me, was rendered effectively defenseless because of a legal technicality in the way the law is written. Given no other choice, I was forced to plea out to avert a costly, unwinnable trial, Hale recalled. Hale was a signals intelligence analyst at the U.S. Air Force. He was deployed to Afghanistan, stationed at the Bagram Air Base. Hale later worked as a contractor for a firm known as Leonidas. His contracting job gave him documents on the U.S. military drone program, which he shared with journalists, including Intercept co-founder Jeremy Scahill. The documents from the 2010s, which Hale revealed, brought attention to the sheer amount of civilian death caused by targeted killing operations. For example, one 5-month period of Operation Haymaker in northeastern Afghanistan, nearly 90% of the people killed in the airstrikes were not the intended targets. And so this was, really disappointing that Hale was thrown in jail rather than being given a medal in the first place. And good that he is now out. He was able to survive his 33 months in prison, but still, absolutely horrific they had to undergo it in the first place. Next up here, news on another whistleblower. Jad Teixeira pleads guilty for leaking Pentagon documents, faces up to 16 years in prison. Massachusetts Air National Guardsman Jad Teixeira pled guilty on Monday for leaking Pentagon documents to a Discord server that surfaced in the media last year and revealed the U.S. government lies about the Ukraine proxy war. With his guilty plea, Teixeira agrees to a deal that will see him serve a harsh sentence of between 11 and 16 years in prison. The final sentence will be decided by a federal judge in September. After the guilty plea, Teixeira's family issued a statement saying he had taken responsibility for his part in the leaks. The statement also pointed to an investigation by the Air Force Inspector General on the 102nd Intelligence Wing that Teixeira worked in. The statement said the lackadaisical work atmosphere, the lack of adequate training and oversight, combined with the complete disregard for policy and procedure, directly and indirectly contributed to what happened. After the Air Force investigation, the commanding officer of the 107th Intelligence Wing was removed from his post, and 14 other members of the Air National Guard were disciplined for the leaks. Teixeira was initially named as the leaker by the New York Times, which conducted an investigation with Bellingcat to identify him. He shared the classified documents with friends on a private Discord server that had only about 25 members, a group of young men and teenage boys. According to the Washington Post, there are about 300 photos of documents he shared, but many were buried by the mainstream outlets that obtained them, which is a crime against the American people. Unless those documents are somehow proven to be like false or counterfeit or something like that, the Washington Post and the New York Times, who I believe are the two outlets that have copies of these documents, are really committing a criminal act against the American people, at least an act of, criminalism and journalism here, by not publishing these documents. Again, there could be maybe some very limited circumstances where it wouldn't be appropriate to publish these documents. Maybe they're just list of phone numbers of spouses of Pentagon employees. That's not what they are. They're like the rest of the documents. I'm almost positive of it. And they have important information for the American people that we should have known back in 2023. But, at least tell us now and, allow us to know what the Washington Post and the New York Times knew all this time and why they're not sharing it with the rest of us. Some of the most significant revelations of the Discord leaks included the fact that the U.S. did not think that Ukraine would succeed in the 2020 counteroffensive, but pushed for it anyways. This is really, I think, the most significant thing here, because if we had looked at the Teixeira documents and people had taken them seriously and had actually debated the Ukraine policy based on them, then they could have not gone through with the 2023 counteroffensive in Ukraine that has been an abysmal failure, right? Like, it's not just that tens of thousands of Ukrainians died, that a lot of billions of dollars of military equipment were destroyed in those operations, but now the Ukrainian army is in desperate need of weapons, ammunition, all these kinds of supplies that they don't have because they used it all the men that got killed during that counteroffensive. And so this has been a huge problem for the Ukrainian military. And, our media has just done us a great disservice by not discussing it more. All right, this is probably the best big news of the day. Idaho Senate passes Defend the Guard Act. On Monday, Idaho Senate passed Defend the Guard legislation that would prohibit the deployment of the state's National Guard to combat zones without a declaration of war from Congress as required by the Constitution. The bill was introduced in January by Senator Ben Adams, and it passed with a vote of 27 to 8. It now heads to the Senate state's House of Representatives for consideration. Idaho Senate is the third state legislature to approve Defend the Guard. This is the third legislative body to pass Defend the Guard this year, following New Hampshire and Arizona. Bring Our Troops Home, the group behind Defend the Guard wrote on X. Defend the Guard is a national movement to rein in the power of the federal government's ability to wage war by restricting the deployment of the National Guard to dangerous combat zones. With defendtheguard.us to see the Defend the Guard Act has been introduced in your state. Click here, and Dave has a link in his article here at antiwar.com if you want to check it out to volunteer. This seems to be gaining a lot of momentum and moving in the right direction. I believe in Texas, it actually passed the a vote of the Republican voters for the Super Tuesday vote. So that was another positive, but I'll have a little bit more information on that later in the week. I'm not familiar with Texas law, so I don't know how significant that ballot measure was. All right, here's the last of the good news stories for today. Victoria Newland's notorious Russia hawk resigning from the State Department. So Newland, a notorious Russia hawk, most known for a role in the 2014 coup in Ukraine, will be retiring from the State Department in the coming weeks, Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced on Tuesday. Newland has worked as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs since 2021 and served as the acting Deputy Secretary of State for a few months until the position was filled by Kurt Campbell, a notorious China hawk. Newland is the wife of Robert Kagan, one of the most influential American neoconservatives, and has worked for multiple administrations. In the George W. Bush administration, she served as Deputy Foreign Policy Advisor to then Vice President Dick Cheney from 2003 to 2005, and later as the U.S. representative to NATO. And so you think that would just about disqualify her from taking any job for anything ever. I mean, that seems like something that would probably bar her from working the drive-thru at McDonald's, but yet somehow she gets hired to a top-ranking job in the State Department in the Biden administration. In the Obama administration, Newland worked as the State Department spokeswoman and then as the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, where she supported the Maidan protests in the Ukraine that led to the overthrow of former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. A lead phone call between Newland and then U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, who is also in the current administration, was published in February of 2014. And that is the notorious F the EU phone call where they openly plot out and plan the coup going on in Ukraine. And they went through with it even though their phone call was published and made public. It really revealing just how little these people who claim that everything in the world is about democracy, how little they actually care about it. The 2014 coup sparked a civil war in Ukraine that led to Russia absorbing Crimea and NATO providing training and other kinds of support for the Ukrainians. These factors and others ultimately led to the February 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. In her current role, Newland championed the proxy war in Ukraine and has been responsible for some of the most hawkish rhetoric coming from the Biden administration. Remember, she's the one that touted America's ability to disable the Nord Stream pipelines before they were destroyed. And so this woman is really a lunatic. Now, this may be good news and this may be questionably good news. So, it could signify a couple things. I think it probably signifies that the neocons don't believe that Joe Biden is going to win re-election. And so we're going to see some of the hawks within the White House start to jump ship over the next 6 months and kind of move back to what they call the private sector, but which is really like, just public money that's funneled through the military industrial complex and into the hands of neocons so they could produce more, they could go on TV and tell the American people that we need to go to war here or there, or Russia's a threat, China's a threat, Hamas is a threat, Hezbollah's a threat, Iranians, Houthis, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, whoever they don't like that week, they're going to tell us that we have to go to war with that country. And it also, allows them to write articles and have all these fancy jobs and titles and form these think tanks and institutes and all these other things. So my guess is that we're going to see Victoria, who knows, maybe she'll say, I'm going to be spending a lot more time with my family, which just means hanging out with the neocons at one of these, semi-public private think tanks that again, just launder money from the military industrial complex and take that money and use it to try to sell the American people more wars. I don't think she's actually retiring from her warmongering duties. Newland will be temporarily replaced by John Bass, another career U.S. government official who currently serves as the Undersecretary of State for Management. Bass was previously the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan during the withdrawal from that country, according to his biography on the State Department website. He also worked for former Vice President Dick Cheney. You will almost think that a job requirement at the White House at this point would be not having worked in the Bush administration, but it seems to almost be the opposite. All right, next up, this is an article I wrote on March 4th for the Institute. U.S. deploys anti-drone laser systems in the Middle East to test field test prototypes. So the Department of Defense has deployed 4 laser systems designed to intercept drones and rockets in the Middle East. The Pentagon has been developing a laser interceptor to reduce the cost of shooting down UAVs and rockets. Army Vice Chief of Staff General James Mingus announced the new development of the Direct Energy Maneuver Short Range Defense, Air Defense, and this is known as DEM Charade. And they are prototypes and they are being sent to the Middle East. The Army developed the weapons in coordination with RTS, which is formerly Raytheon, and that is, of course, the former employer of the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. RTS has received over $100 million to develop the platform. The DEM Charade, according to RTS, is a 50 kilowatt vehicle-mounted laser designed to intercept drones, missiles, and rockets at short range. RTS and the Pentagon believe the laser system will be a cheaper alternative for downing drones and rockets. The 4 interceptors deployed to the Middle East are mounted on Stryker armored vehicles. The Pentagon funding bill for 2024 authorized nearly $700 million in spending on the Charade systems for both development and procurement. American soldiers occupying Iraq and Syria have come under rocket attack and drone attack over 150 times in the past 5 months, although these strikes have slowed up in the past few weeks. The strikes come in response to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza, which is backed by the U.S., with Shia militia groups taking responsibility for some of the attacks. After a drone killed 3 American soldiers in Jordan near the Syrian border, President Joe Biden ordered a massive round of airstrikes on Iraq and Syria. Dozens were killed, including some civilians. The Pentagon believes the Middle East is a good environment to test the DEM Charade, as it will present unique challenges. Our energy lasers are also susceptible to weather. That's why I think this is going to be a great laboratory, because anytime there's a dust storm, anytime there's that kind of thing, it starts to alter the physics of light particles that actually shoot at the beams, Mingus explained. And one question I have here is, are we essentially using our soldiers in the Middle East as target practice? Does the U.S. assume that eventually these drone and rocket attacks against American forces are going to restart, particularly, say, if Israel attacks the city of Rafa and starts to slaughter civilians there, or the death toll in Gaza just starts to tick up significantly higher, either through the famine or Israeli attacks? But either way, if those attacks restart in Iraq, this would certainly give these systems a chance to see if they work. However, if they don't work, if there's a dust storm or something goes on and one of these rockets or drones get through, are we basically just playing games here with the lives of the American soldiers in the Middle East? All right, an update on Haiti, and for those of you who either consistently listen to the show or read my news section at the Libertarian Institute, know I spend a lot of time covering Haiti, particularly because the Biden administration has been working for a couple years now to put together a international UN force to deploy to Haiti. And we're getting pretty close to those troops going to Haiti, it seems. But the situation in Haiti got far worse over the weekend. There was even discussion of American troops being deployed to the Caribbean nation. So the article I wrote, official dismisses sending U.S. troops to Haiti after diplomats float idea. A few days after U.S. and Haitian diplomats discussed sending U.S. special forces to Haiti to help Prime Minister Ariel Henry regain control over the capital city, a White House official dismissed the idea of deploying soldiers to the Caribbean nation. According to McClatchy, D.C., U.S. and Haitian diplomats held what they described as frantic conversations late last week that raised the prospect of an emergency deployment of U.S. Special Forces. On Monday, the outlet reported speaking with a White House National Security Council official who dismissed the possibility. The United States is not sending U.S. troops to Haiti to support the Haitian National Police security operations, the official explained. We are urgently mobilizing all support we and the international community can immediately provide to Haiti, especially the Haitian National Police, to ensure they are able to restore security for the sake of the people. The support the official is referring to is a Kenyan-led force that will see thousands of armed men deployed to Haiti. Late last year, the United States Security Council approved the mission and refers to the international deployment to Haiti as a police force rather than a UN peacekeeping mission, or calling them soldiers, as that's what they are. Washington has worked to get the Security Council to approve the armed deployment to Haiti and is spending $200 million to finance the operations. The discussion about sending U.S. troops to Haiti came as the government in Port-au-Prince, led by Henry, is losing control over the capital city. Henry has slowly lost control over Port-au-Prince since he ascended to power in 2021 with Washington's backing. The branding of the international mission as police force is likely aimed at quelling Haitian concerns about armed foreign fighters in their country. UN peacekeepers have a dark legacy in Haiti, including rampant sexual abuse, including of minor women. Really awful and disgusting things happened during that 2004 mission to Haiti. But probably the most significant was, or most wide-reaching at least, was the cholera outbreak caused by the UN peacekeepers releasing wastewater into clean water, and that cholera outbreak killed about 10,000 people. The deployment of a UN force to Haiti was obstructed first by the Kenyan opposition, which challenged sending a force abroad at the High Court in Nairobi. Initially, it appeared the court blocked the deployment. However, Kenyan President William Ruto inked an agreement with Henry last week that bypassed the court ruling. Ruto and National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby have called to, quote, expedite the deployment of the Kenyan-led force. Ruto says Kenya is willing to send 1,000 people dubbed police, while Benin is willing to send another 2,000 armed men. And there's a group of other, particularly Caribbean nations that are, more aligned with the US or UK, who are also willing to send a force, but they haven't said how high it is, so I'm guessing it's probably a relatively trivial number. As Henry traveled to Kenya to sign the agreement, attacks on government-controlled areas in Haiti have increased. There have been raids on jail that have seen the release of about 4,000 prisoners, and attacks on the airport in Port-au-Prince. At least 12 people have been killed in the fighting. Henry's security forces suffered a series of losses to the opposition in recent weeks. The opposition to Henry is often dismissed as criminal gangs. However, the main opposition group, Ba Kale, is a vigilante group that gained power in opposition to the gangs. The leader of the vigilante group, Jimmy Shavir, and he is known by his nickname Barbecue, and they kind of really try to use this nickname Barbecue to imply like he's just some gangster who has a reputation for cooking his enemies alive. Which, I don't want to say this guy is a non-violent man. He seems very willing to use violent means to try to rein in the gang problem, and now I think essentially kind of consolidate control over Port-au-Prince. But there is a difference between like being a criminal drug lord whose main goal is that, rather than a vigilante group who sees a massive vacuum of power in the capital city that, there's a lot of gang violence that's creating a lot of problems and is trying this way to address it. I don't know if, this guy taking control in Haiti will lead to a reform system or anything like that, but it really should be up to the Haitians to decide, and the Haitian people, not Ariel Henry, who did not come to power by the will of the people. In fact, he was unelected. He was outside of the government. The then president Jovenel Moïse was assassinated in July of 2021, and then the then prime minister was Claude Joseph, who really should have been the man who ascended to power. But the Western leaders pushed Claude Joseph to agree to step down and put Henry in his place. And he's just been completely unpopular, hasn't been able to achieve anything. There's really not an elected government in Haiti. But what Henry has really focused his attention on is working with the U.S. to get the UN Security Council to pass this resolution that will allow Kenyan forces to come into Haiti and work with his his police force to give Henry back order. The problem is if he's not a popular president, even restoring and handing him back order would only be a temporary solution. And so again, the Haitian people should be allowed to decide their problems. And I think the only reason the Biden administration is even really showing any interest or getting involved at all is that Haitian migrants ended up showing up in the US, and with Biden kind of tying his hands, where if you have any kind of strict border policy, well, he called Trump a Nazi for 4 years. And so, well, he's now willing to make concessions on that. But, initially, the Biden administration really tried not to have a strict border policy whatsoever. And so rather than, Haitians showing up at the southern border and trying to get in the country, the idea was basically to send a bunch of African police or armed African men, essentially soldiers, on the ground in Haiti and to, quote, restore order, which, just means doing violent things to prevent the Haitian people from being able to leave their country, which is a pretty awful policy. All right, next up here, German military leak reveals British soldiers are in Ukraine helping fire Storm Shadow missiles. So this is Dave DeCamp, March 4th, antiwar.com. British soldiers are on the ground in Ukraine helping Ukrainian forces fire Storm Shadow missiles, according to a leaked recording of a conversation between German military officers that was published by Russian media. Germany confirmed the authenticity of the recording and said the British did not dispute the claim. The UK confirmed last week that it had a small number of troops inside Ukraine who are supporting the Ukrainian armed forces. The UK first started to ship Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine last year, which marked a significant escalation of NATO support since they have a range of 155 miles. Further than any other NATO-provided missile. France has also provided Ukraine with the French variant of Storm Shadow, known as the Scout missile, but doesn't have troops helping with targeting on the ground, according to the leaked recordings. In the recordings, the German lieutenant general, and is actually the head of the German Air Force, described how the British assets assist in Ukraine. When it comes to mission planning, I know the English do it. They do it completely in reach back. They also have a few people on the ground. They do that the French don't. He went on to discuss the possibility of Germany providing Ukraine with Taurus missiles, which would double Ukraine's strike capabilities as they could hit targets with 300 miles away. In conversations, the officers say the Taurus missile could likely be used to blow up the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland and has already been attacked twice by Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has been asking for these Taurus missiles for quite some time. It seems the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is not very keen on sending them, and in the past they have actually discussed the possibility of limiting the range of the Taurus missiles before sending them. I'm not sure what the current discussions are on these missiles going inside Berlin. The Kremlin said the lead conversations makes it clear that plans to conduct strikes inside Russia are under discussion within the German military. The leaked recordings came after German Chancellor Olaf Scholz suggested French and British troops were inside Ukraine. He made the comments while explaining his reasoning for not supplying Ukraine with Taurus missiles, saying it would require German troop presence on the field to match the level of the British or French support for Ukraine's use of Storm Shadows. Scholz also said providing that kind of support would make Germany a direct party to the conflict, since the Taurus missiles have such a long range they can be used to hit targets deep inside Russia. The leaked recordings also come after French President Macron stirred an uproar by saying sending NATO troops to Ukraine shouldn't be ruled out, despite the obvious risk of a direct Russia-NATO war, which could quickly turn nuclear. His comments highlight the fact that the presence of NATO special operators are already inside Ukraine and has been an open secret for some time, especially since March of 2023, where the Discord leads, of course, by Jad Teixeira, showed us that was happening, that there was about 100 NATO special operators in the country. Next up here, this one from Will Porter. Senator Rubio says Ukraine can't win war, but bets more aid anyways. So Will writes, Republican Senator Marco Rubio has acknowledged that Ukraine will not achieve victory over Russia, saying he has long known that Kiev could not prevail, but avoided the issue in public. The lawmakers nonetheless called for additional U.S. military support, hoping to create leverage for future peace talks. Speaking to Fox News Sunday, Rubio said that while Russian forces would not seize all of Ukraine, Kiev could fail to reach its stated goals on the battlefield, which include reclaiming all territory lost to Moscow. And so, there's a couple really important omissions in here. I think maybe three of them. One, that he knew this all along and was lying to the American people about it is pretty extreme. Number two, he admits that Russia isn't going to take all of Ukraine. And of course, the narrative coming out of the Republican Party and out of the White House is that Russia is going to take all of Ukraine, and once they're done with Ukraine, they're coming after Poland next. So, that cuts against those two, pretty desperately. And then also that, we're going to continue to support this mission that we know is going to fail. So Rubio said, "I'm just being honest, and in the past, I have tried not to talk about this publicly because I thought it would undermine the leverage that Ukraine had, but now it's a reality. Neither side is going to be able to achieve victory as defined in the most idealistic terms," Rubio said, who serves as the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. However, despite admitting Ukraine's bleak perspectives on the war, Rubio said Washington must continue to provide military support, hoping the arms would help Kiev's position at the negotiating table. U.S. aid to Ukraine has virtually ground to a halt in recent months as lawmakers battle over legislation to supply $60 billion in weapons to Kiev, as well as billions for Israel and other U.S. allies. While the Senate passed its own version of the bill last month, the Republican-controlled House has refused to take up the measure unless Democrats agree to major reforms on U.S. immigration policy. Rubio has argued much the same, saying we should help Ukraine, but only after we help the Americans through our border. Though some Republican senators have called to keep the arms flowing for as long as it takes, among them outgoing GOP leader Mitch McConnell, other members of the party have begun to shift focus to negotiated settlement. Senator Mike Braun told Politico, "It looks like this could go on for a long, long time. That looks like a line that we should take immense amount of money and time to move off of where it is." And J.D. Vance similarly predicted a stalemate even with U.S. support. That stance differs sharply from the White House, which has urged Congress to pass the Mammoth Aid bill. President Joe Biden continues to voice support for Kiev's maximalist war aims and has pledged indefinite U.S. support despite major setbacks for Ukrainian forces since their lackluster counteroffensive last summer. All right, next up here is one I wrote for the Institute. NATO conducts large-scale war games across Nordic states. NATO's Nordic members, this is Finland, Sweden, and Norway. And Sweden is an official but unofficial member at this point. All other member states have approved their membership into NATO. I think their official membership, like the ceremony part of it, will occur this summer at the NATO summit. I believe it's in June. So those three nations are hosting massive war games. Finland and Sweden are the newest members of the alliance and will each contribute over 4,000 soldiers to the drills. The war games, dubbed Nordic Response 2024, will run between March 4th and March 15th. Over 20,000 NATO troops from 13 countries will participate, with over 50 allied naval vessels and over 100 aircraft set to take part in the exercises. According to the NATO press release, the drills will focus on the defense and protection of the Nordic region. 2 states in the region joined the alliance over the past year. Finland's ascension into the bloc doubled NATO's border with Russia. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine more than 2 years ago, Western officials have repeatedly warned that Moscow would continue its march westward and enter a direct war with NATO. Top Kremlin officials, including President Vladimir Putin, have dismissed the charges, insisting Russia would not seek to disband its borders further, while claiming Ukraine poses a unique security threat. The latest drills are part of NATO's Steadfast Defender military exercises, the blot's largest series of war games in history, which will see over 90,000 troops participate in about a dozen maneuvers from January through August. The U.S. and its NATO allies defend their frequent large-scale drills as important to preparedness and maintaining deterrence. However, adversaries view such exercises as provocative, at times denouncing them as preparations for preemptive war. And this isn't just something that's true with Russia, but is rather true essentially across the board. As far as it goes, there are, if you look at North Korea, if you look at Iran, if you look at China, all these countries view the U.S. war games on their shores as highly provocative. Something similar happened with Venezuela. The U.S. starts carrying out war games with Guyana, and then Venezuela feels the need to put more troops on their border with Guyana. So, these war games are billed as deterrents, but they are massive provocations. All right, last up on the Ukraine war front, Canada considering sending troops to Ukraine for training. Canada is open to sending troops back to Ukraine to train Ukrainian forces if the right conditions are met, the Canadian Defense Minister Bill Blair said on Tuesday. Like many other NATO countries, Canada began training Ukrainian forces inside Ukraine following the 2014 U.S.-backed coup that ousted former Ukrainian President Yanukovych. But since the February 2022 Russian invasion, Canada has been training Ukrainians inside the UK, Latvia, and Poland. Last year, the Discord leads confirmed there were a small number of NATO special operator forces inside Ukraine, including troops from the US, UK, France, and Latvia, but there's no sign Canadians have been in the country. Right now, circumstances are not appropriate for that training to take place in Ukraine, but we're going to continue to train. We have had a number of discussions with the Ukrainians that suggest when the conditions are right, we may be able to return. And while the White House has presented Ukraine's biggest problem as being the equipment shortages, in my opinion, it seems that Ukraine's biggest problem is the manpower shortages. Even if they had an infinite supply of money, if you don't have the men to arm and use those weapons, they're relatively worthless. And that's kind of the situation right now going on in Ukraine. It takes a lot of time to train soldiers. It takes a large amount of time to train an entire army. And that's what Ukraine needs right now. And so training a few thousand soldiers in a bunch of different European countries isn't going to achieve the aims, the ends that Ukraine is looking for. It's not going to give them the soldiers that they need across the front to really fight Russia. And so I see why the Canadians are talking about this, but it doesn't seem likely to me at all that this is going to happen anytime soon, that the security situation in Ukraine would improve to the point where they would feel comfortable not only training Ukrainian troops within Ukraine, which would be a problem because they would be easy targets for Russian missiles, but then, being willing to put NATO forces inside Ukraine and, of course, make them potential targets for the Russians as well. All right, this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Philippine-Chinese Coast Guard vessels collide again in South China Sea. China and Philippines are trading blame for the latest collision between Chinese and Philippines vessels in the South China Sea as tensions remain high over the disputed reefs in the waters. The collision occurred on Tuesday morning near the Second Thomas Shoal, and 4 Filipino crew members were injured. The Philippines uses a grounded ship on the Second Thomas Shoal as a base for operations in the region, and China often blots resupplements to the vessel. The maritime dispute sparks risk of major war since the U.S. has repeatedly warned China that the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippine vessels in the South China Sea, meaning the U.S. is threatening to intervene if the dispute turns hot. After the coalition, a spokesperson for the Chinese military guard said the Philippines violated its commitments and deliberately sent 2 Coast Guard ships to supply the ships. The Philippines is dishonest in this dialogue, deliberately stirs up trouble, maliciously incites and sensationalizes, and continues to undermine the peace and stability of the South China Sea, the spokesperson added. In response, a spokesperson for the Philippines Coast Guard said their vessel faced a dangerous maneuvers and blocking, and said China's reckless and illegal actions caused the collision. And look, there can be disputes around the world, and the Philippines and China could have these issues. The problem here is that the Americans are the U.S. government is trying to force the American people to take the side of the Philippine government. All right, next up here, China wars CIA is ramping up its spy war. So the Ministry of State Security, MSS, posted on WeChat, CIA has committed substantially more resources towards China-related intelligence collection, operations, and analysis around the world, more than doubling its percentage of its overall budget focused on China over the past 2 years. CIA is hiring and training more Mandarin speakers, expanding the confrontation against China to every corner of the agency. In recent years, the USA, on the other hand, started intelligence wars, sparring no effort to step up its espionage against China, and on the other hand, brought suit against its victims, scandalously smearing China as justifiable defense and trying to misrepresent the counter espionage law of PRC as an evil law. And so this is expected, but just interesting little note here from the Chinese on it in their position. All right, next up here, talking about the war in Gaza, this one from Mondo Weiss. Biden says give Israel a little bit more time. Mondo Weiss reports Joe Biden says that critics of his Gaza policy should give Israel's bombing a little more time. This is the quote from the president. I don't want to see any Palestinians killed. I think that's contrary to what we believe in as Americans. I think they have to give just a little bit more time, understanding what would happen if they came to their state or their neighborhood and saw what happened with Hamas. The pressure on leadership to move with every ounce of capacity against Hamas is real, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be continued. It doesn't mean it's right. And so I think I'm praying that you're going to see a significant downturn in the use of force. And all this is just so ridiculous for Joe Biden that Israel needs just a little bit more time when you have children starving to death. There is no more time to give Israel, Biden. You have to pull the plug on the support. But the president has shown no willingness to do that or change the policy whatsoever. All right. So, as Biden is saying, give Israel just a little bit more time, UNICEF warns child deaths in Gaza due to Israel's siege will increase rapidly. At least 16 Palestinian children have starved to death in Gaza over the past few days due to the U.S.-Israeli bad siege, and the UN's Child Relief Agency is warning that the number of children deaths will increase rapidly if conditions don't change. So this is the UNICEF director for Middle East and North Africa. Last week, we warned that an explosion in child deaths was imminent if the nutrition crisis wasn't resolved. Now the children's deaths we feared are here and are likely to rapidly increase unless the war ends and obstacles to humanitarian relief are immediately resolved. Last week, the latest Palestinian child reported to have died from hunger was a 10-year-old with cerebral palsy who was in the Al-Najjar hospital in Rafa. 15 children have also died of malnutrition and dehydration at the Kamal Adwa hospital in northern Gaza. The UN has previously warned that Gaza's entire population, about 2.2 million people, is facing crisis levels of food insecurity, and over 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza are facing catastrophic levels of deprivation and starvation. Despite the dire situation, the State Department reaffirmed on Monday that it will continue to provide Israel military assistance for the genocidal war. The U.S. is still not pushing for an immediate ceasefire or using military aid as leverage over Israel to allow more aid trucks into Gaza. And in fact, it is so much worse than that. This from Date to Camp, March 5th, antiwar.com. Israel still blocking U.S.-funded flour shipment into Gaza. Israel is blocking a U.S.-funded flour shipment into Gaza that was announced by the White House 46 days ago, a U.S. official told the Times of Israel. Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich initially said he blocked the shipment because it was going through the UN's Palestinian Relief Agency, known as UNRWA. About 2 weeks ago, U.S. officials said Israel agreed to unblock the shipment and send it through the World Food Program, but it still hasn't entered Gaza, where children are dying of starvation. The flour is still stuck at an Israeli port. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told the U.S. in January that he would allow the shipment to go through, but has not been true to his word. The U.S. official did not elaborate on why the flour continues to be blocked. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, who has become one of the real faces of this genocide, referenced the flour when asked about Israeli ministers who are still restricting aid to Gaza. UFC ministers in the Israeli government blocked the release of flour from the port. UFC ministers in the Israeli government supporting protests aimed at blocking aid going in through the Israeli crossing. Miller insisted that the U.S. has said the restrictions on aid are unacceptable, but the Biden administration isn't using any of its significant leverage over Israel since it continues to provide unconditional military aid for the slaughter and starvation of the Palestinians. Instead of using its leverage over Israel, the U.S. has begun dropping aid from planes over Gaza over the weekend and carried out another airdrop of about 36,000 meals with the Jordanian Air Force on Tuesday. Ozfan said the airdrops were mostly to serve to relieve the guilty conscience of senior U.S. officials whose policies are contributing to the ongoing atrocities and risk of famine in Gaza. And so, just so people understand how much of a publicity stunt this is. Prior to October 7th, there was 500 aid trucks entering Gaza every day, and that was needed to sustain the population. Since October 7th, nobody has a job. All the markets have been destroyed. All the bakeries have been destroyed. Nearly all the hospitals have been destroyed. Everybody is displaced. Everybody is home. There's not food, right? Like, people are starving to death. They are in dire need, right? And so if there were 500 aid trucks still entering Gaza every day, the situation would still be unsustainable, right? That isn't enough aid. You need significantly more aid. You probably need thousands of aid trucks entering Gaza a day to support the civilian population. However, the number of aid trucks entering Gaza has significantly decreased since October 7th. And through the first couple months of the war, it was very low in the hundreds a day. I think during the 1 week ceasefire in November, it was over about 200 a day for a couple days. But generally speaking, the number of aid trucks entering Gaza has been between 1 and 200 a day. That was from October through January. That has been further restricted. And in fact, in February, there were weeks where only 50 aid trucks were entering Gaza a day. And some sources have actually said that on certain days that number was as low as being in the teens or low 20s. So, as there's more people dependent on aid, Israel has restricted the amount of aid going into Gaza. This is a severe problem. And when the U.S. does an airdrop of aid over Gaza, let's say those airdrops were the equivalent of 100 trucks, and the U.S. was doing multiple aid drops every day. It's not the ideal way to distribute aid, but at least you're maybe injecting so much aid into Gaza that it's going to have a serious benefit. However, these aid drops only contain about as much aid as would be on 2 trucks, right? And so the U.S. has aid dropped the equivalent of 4 or 5 trucks worth of aid into Gaza. This is insignificant. It's meaningless. It doesn't change anything. All it does is it, maybe convinces some Democrats in the U.S. that what Biden is doing in Gaza really isn't that bad, and it overall drops the pressure on the Biden administration to just cut off aid to Gaza, which is really needed. All right. Next up here, lead cable says Rafa attack will cause catastrophic humanitarian consequences. So this is a document obtained by The Intercept, and Ken Klippenstein writes, the cable written by officials with the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at USAID warn about the potential effects of an all-out Israeli ground invasion on Rafa, where about 1.5 million Palestinians driven south by the Israeli evacuation orders are sheltering from Israel's war on Gaza. A potential escalation of military operations within southern Gaza's Rafa governorate could result in the catastrophic humanitarian consequences, including mass civilian casualties, extensive population displacement, and the collapse of existing humanitarian response. Multiple relief agencies have warned USAID, the cable says. Ahead of the proposed military operation, the impact of hostilities has stretched beyond the capacity of Gaza's healthcare system, the cable adds. And the key point, the cable says, an offensive in Rafa would likely block the entry and transportation of fuel and life-saving humanitarian assistance throughout the enclave, rendering critical infrastructure inoperable and leaving people in Gaza without food, medicine, shelter, and water. Though highlighting the consequences of the Israeli ground invasion of Rafa, the cable also includes a more subtle warning. Rafa is well past the point of crisis, with Israeli bombs already raining down. And so, again, this is the U.S. government. It's not great, but at least, we do have these documents. That way, when the Biden administration pretends like they didn't know what was happening, they knew. They knew this was a genocide, and they support it. All right, next up here, another one from Will Porter. Our good friend is doing some more writing for us at the Libertarian Institute, which has been absolutely fantastic. UN experts condemn Israel for aid convoy massacre. Special rapporteurs with the United Nations have rebuked Israel after its forces opened fire on hundreds of Palestinians gathered around aid trucks in the Gaza Strip, killing at least 112 people and injuring another 800 more. And again, I talked about this on the show. I don't think we're ever going to get a really good casualty count for what happened here. If you look at videos the day after, there's bodies. It looks like a scene that I guess to me would like be medieval plaguish, right? Where you have a guy on a donkey cart with a bunch of dead bodies on the back of it, and where he's taking them, maybe to a morgue, maybe to a cemetery, maybe they're just going to bury these people somewhere so they can have a somewhat dignified resting place. Who knows? But even though part of the reason why the Gaza Health Ministry's assessment is of the 30,000 people at least have died is somewhat accurate, is there are a lot of Gazans who have been basically through this before, not this severe, of course, but the Israeli military campaign, and the people of Gaza kind of know if somebody dies from an Israeli airstrike, you really need to get them to a morgue, a hospital, some kind of international center. That way, they could be counted and registered and everything like that. And so people know who died and where, and their family members can know. All these things are important, right? So I'm not exactly sure what the true toll here is. And again, when we talk about nearly 800 people injured, well, those are only people who are injured enough to go seek medical care in Gaza, right? I'm sure that if anything short of maybe a broken bone, a laceration that really requires stitches and antibiotics, a serious gunshot wound, you're probably just gonna like go back home and try to tend to it there, because the hospitals are overcrowded. They don't have aid, medication, or anything anyways. And so I'm guessing a lot of people don't go to the hospital and could, end up dying of some kind of injury they didn't know they had. Or so the death toll here could be significantly higher than is being reported, but I do think those are pretty good minimum numbers. In a press release issued on Tuesday, a group of 7 UN experts accused Israel of wielding food as a weapon against Gaza's population of 2.3 million, saying it was intentionally starving the Palestinian people. They added that the IDF troops were now targeting civilians seeking humanitarian aid, citing the February 29th flower massacre in Gaza City. The attack came after Israel denied humanitarian aid into Gaza and most of northern Gaza for more than a month, the UN officials wrote, saying that Tel Aviv must end its campaign of starvation and targeting civilians. And I have read 2 other reports of aid convoys being attacked by Israel since the flower massacre. I haven't been able to confirm quite as solidly that it was a similar situation where the Israelis really did open fire on a group of civilians. Certainly, at least one of the times it does seem they did open fire around a convoy of aid, but it's unclear to me, this time they actually fired on and killed a substantial number of civilians with bullets, where it doesn't seem like that has happened quite so severely, at least the other two cases. The slaughter has unfolded last Thursday as a large crowd of Palestinians gathered to wait for desperately needed aid deliveries. As the convoy carrying flour passed through the area, the situation became chaotic, with people racing to grab supplies from the trucks, witnesses told the AP. IDF soldiers were said to have fired on the crowd in two bursts. The first of which was sent many scrambling for cover. When they re-emerged and returned to the aid trucks, the soldiers continued shooting. The witnesses added that killing over 100 civilians and injuring at least 760. According to Al Jazeera, who was a reporter who was present at the massacre, Israeli tanks advanced and ran over many of the dead and injured bodies after the shooting. The IDF spokesperson insisted that the soldiers merely fired warning shots in an effort to secure the area, claiming the resulting carnage was instead caused by a stampede. However, the acting director of the Al-Alda hospital has contested that the account, saying that most of the 161 patients he treated that day suffered gunshot wounds. And so there's really no way to justify this for Israel. Their forces opening fire on a crowded group of hungry Palestinians is like the kind of horror that Americans really only imagine happening in the movies set in Africa or something like that, where people could be so cruel as to kill a bunch of civilians just scrambling to get a little bit of food to feed their families. But this is a genocide, so this is what happens. The UN experts went on to say that Israeli forces have fired on humanitarian aid convoys on several other occasions during the Gaza war, despite the fact that convoys have shared their coordinates with Israel. And we had discussed one of these, which was confirmed by CNN last month on the show. In early February, a column of 10 aid trucks bearing the UN insignia was forced to turn back after an Israeli naval vessel shelled one of the vehicles, scoring a direct hit and destroying much of the cargo. Last Saturday, just days after the February 29th massacre, 9 others were killed in a separate Israeli attack on an aid truck, according to local press reports. Yet another shooting took place the following Monday when the IDF troops again fired on Gazans waiting for flour, though it remains unclear if any were killed in the incident. So Will does a pretty good job of talking about those other incidents that I was talking about right there. The flow of aid into Gaza has slowed to a trickle amid near consistent Israeli bombardment, which has devastated much of the coastal enclave over 5 months of war. More than 1.9 million Palestinians have been displaced during the onslaught, with hundreds of thousands now seeking refuge in the southern city of Rafa amid fears of a growing IDF invasion. The UN and other rights groups have warned of a looming humanitarian catastrophe, with the deputy head of the World Food Program saying that more than 500,000 people were now at immediate risk of famine. 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 are acutely malnourished, while the risk of disease has spiked dramatically thanks to squalid conditions in Gaza's overcrowded refugee camps. And the 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 is really important, because once children under the age of 2 are severely acutely malnourished, and I think this is true essentially for all children generally, but particularly, children under the age of 5 or 2, when they reach this level of malnutrition, they also enter into something called wasting. And that means, their body, in an attempt to survive, is going to start shutting down and doing various things. I'm not a doctor, I don't want to get into all of it. But, this doesn't require just merely, this 2-year-old who is starving is acutely malnourished. Oh, here's a loaf of bread. We'll give him this and he'll be, it takes actual medical, there's probably going to be lifelong medical ramifications from this. But additionally, there's going to need to be, medical, things performed and provided to these children to get them even back to a place where they're stable. Just eating a little bit of food or eating a normal amount of food isn't going to resolve this situation for these kids. This is a serious health issue that they are ongoing that requires a recovery period. More than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli strikes since October, with thousands more missing and feared dead, according to Gazan health officials. Tel Aviv launched its military operations in the wake of Hamas's October 7th attack, which killed more than 1,100 people and saw around 150 captured by Palestinian fighters. All right, another article from The Intercept here. This one, New York Times reporting a systematic Hamas rape on October 7th exposed again. The Intercept reports 2 of the 3 victims specifically singled out by the New York Times in a marquee expose published in December, which alleged that Hamas had deliberately weaponized sexual violence during the October 7th attacks, were not in fact victims of sexual assault, according to the spokesperson of Kibbutz Be'eri, where the Times identified the location of the attack. The rejection of the Times reporting in the kibbutz by the spokesperson further undermines the credibility of the paper's controversial December article titled "Screams Without Words: How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th." The Times article described 3 alleged victims of sexual assault for whom it reported specific biographical information, one known as the woman in the black dress. Some of her family members have contested these claims made by the Times. The other 2 alleged victims were unnamed teenage sisters in Kibbutz Be'eri, whose precise ages were listed in the Times, making it possible to identify them. According to data from the Israeli government public list, who identified who died at the kibbutz during the October 7th attacks, as well as the memorial page established by the community itself, the victims in the kibbutz matching the description in the New York Times articles were sisters aged 13 and 16, and The Intercept decided not to use their names because they had not been named publicly, but that kibbutz did say they were not sexually assaulted. So that's pretty significant that all the New York Times public accounts of sexual assault on October 7th have now been discredited, not from like independent journalists, but from either the family or the Israeli community where they lived, which is very significant. All right, next up here. Poll shows young American support for Israel plummeting. A new poll found that young American support for Israel is plummeting. Over the past year, the number of adults under the age of 35 who view the country favorably has decreased by 26%. In that age group, more Americans sympathize with the Palestinians. And I wrote this article for the Institute on March 5th. The results from Gallup's World Affairs Survey show support for Israel and the Palestinian Authority has decreased among all ages. For younger Americans, approval for Israel has dropped significantly. The number of Americans aged 18 to 34 who view Israel favorably decreased from 64 to 36%. Support for Israel decreased less significantly among older Americans, but still dropped. For the 35 to 64 age group, favorability for Tel Aviv was about 11% over the past year. The youngest of the 3 age blocks sympathize more with Palestinians than Israelis, 45 to 37%. Overall, about half of the respondents say they sympathize more with the Israelis, and only about a quarter of the Palestinians, and only about a quarter with Palestinians. In the last decade, that gap has narrowed by about 20%. A majority of young Americans and Democrats believe Washington should focus on pressuring Tel Aviv to end the conflict in Gaza. For all age groups, the number of people who believe the White House should pressure the Palestinians is only 3% higher than the number who want the administration to focus its attention on Tel Aviv, and that is another gap that has significantly narrowed over the past decade. The shifting support away from Israel is problematic for President Joe Biden's re-election campaign. While young voters are viewed as a core segment of the president's base, those are the very people most chafed over the president's unfettered support for Israel. Nearly half of young Americans view Israel's operations in Gaza as genocidal. In January, President Biden was denounced at several campaign events by protesters chanting "Genocide Joe." To prevent protesters from disrupting further rallies, the campaign has raised the price of tickets, withheld the location of events from the public, and avoided college campuses. All right. Next up here, British-owned cargo ship sinks days after being hit by Houthi missile. Dave wrote this on March 3rd for antiwar.com. And he says the U.S. military said on Saturday that the Rubio, a British-owned cargo ship that sank in the Red Sea after taking on water following a February 18th Houthi missile strike. The response to the news, the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, vowed they would sink more British ships. The Houthis began targeting American and British commercial vessels after the US and UK started bombing campaign against Yemen on January 12th. The Houthis' foreign deputy minister said Yemen will continue to sink more British ships and any repercussions and other damages will be added to Britain's bill as the rogue state that attacks Yemen and participates with America in sponsoring the ongoing crimes against the civilians in Gaza. All right, U.S. envoy says truce in Gaza will not necessarily extend to Lebanon. U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein said Monday that a truce in Gaza will not necessarily extend to Lebanon as Israel and Hezbollah continue to trade fire across the border. This isn't surprising. We have already heard that some American officials believe that if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, and in fact, the Israeli defense minister has already said this, that if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, Israel is going to use that as an opportunity to ramp up the war against Hezbollah. So even if the Israelis stop the killing in Lebanon, they just want to kill more and more and more, and are killing in Gaza, they want to kill more and more and more and more, and so they're going to go on and start ramp up the killing in Lebanon. So just it really what's happening here is so horrific, and the Biden administration has so much power to make it stop. It is doing absolutely nothing. All right, everybody, I know the shows this week have been long. There's just so much news that I'm trying to get through. Really appreciate you hanging in there with me, and I hope you're enjoying it. Share the show if you can. I've had a ton of people who are listening to my appearances, particularly on my weekly appearance on Judge Napolitano's Judging Freedom. I've had a lot of really kind comments from listeners in those videos. So thank you all so much for sharing those shows and for saying nice things in the comment section. I think it really does help people, turn people on to this show and all the work that I do. So anyways, everybody, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'll be back with more shows later in the week.